Management Committee. Um, let's start the meeting with the present update status from Sonny Blanco from DOE.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Sonny Blanco. I work for the Department of Energy in the Waste Disposition Programs Division. The Liquid Waste Program update is as follows. We got for the Defense Waste Processing Facility. Last time I updated you in April, the facility had produced 20 canisters so far. Since then, the DWPF has produced another 9 canisters for a total of 29 canisters in fiscal year 19. DWPF plans the production of canisters coupled with salt processing at this time. Next, we got the modular caustic site solvent extraction unit and actinide removal process, better known as MCU and ARP-MCU. So the mission for these facilities, the ARP-MCU, has now come to an end. As of June 4th, both facilities have begun preparations for the inventory and flushing needed before making the ARP-MCU transfer lines available for the newly constructed salt waste processing facility. Multiple transfer line modifications will be made this summer in order to allow the final tie-ins of the SWPF facility transfer lines. ARP-MCU served us well as a pilot facility, providing countless lessons learned for the successful operation of SWPF. ARP-MCU, after operating for 11 years, which originally was expected to operate for only 3 years, successfully processed almost 7.5 million gallons of salt solution with more than 404,000 gallons in FY19 alone. Next, the Saltstone facility is in standby and awaiting accumulation of feed in tank 50. Saltstone has processed nearly 703,300 gallons of decontaminated salt solution in fiscal year 19. Our 3H evaporator, since the startup in late July of 2018 and after repair of the vessel, the 3H evaporator has reclaimed over 1.1 million gallons of space gain. That is over 836,000 gallons so far in FY19. 3H evaporator continues to operate very well so far. Tank closure cesium removal, or better known as ticker, is operational. The ticker resumed operations last Friday on June the 21st and began processing batch number 2 at 5 gallons per minute, and it continues to operate. Ticker has processed approximately 172,000 gallons of salt waste from tank 10. And as I have mentioned before, our tank closure cesium removal will supplement existing and planned facilities in the removal of radioactive cesium from the salt waste, keeping the DOE priority of protecting people and the environment. Construction of the Saltstone Disposal Unit 7, or SDU 7, is progressing safely and on schedule. 14 wall sections out of a total of 25 for the structure's outer shell are in place, and 155 columns out of a total of 208 have been completed. Additionally, the entire floor placement was completed back at the end of April, and that was 14 sections in total. The construction work is being completed by subcontractor DN Tanks, who also built SDU 6. Saltstone Disposal Units 8 and 9. Groundbreaking was officially initiated on June 10, and the subcontractor is currently moving ground for SDU 8. Salt Waste Processing Facility, or SWPF, continues with startup and commissioning activities with the contractor operational readiness review, followed by the DOE operational readiness review, scheduled to start in the fall. Approval for SWPF start of operations is forecasted for December 2019. Now for the solid waste program, we have 2 shipments of transuranic waste that have been scheduled for later this year. And SRS and the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant from Carlsbad, New Mexico, are also completing readiness assessments and safety basis related tasks to allow the use of the TruePack 3 package before license expires at the end of the year. That's what I have today.
Thank you. Any comments or any questions? Could you please state your name?
I'm Malcolm Phillips, and in a macro sense, are you before the last update until now, are y'all on schedule, proceeding on schedule in a macro sense, not a micro sense? And-
Yes.
Okay, so everything's
Yes.
going according to schedule. There's been major hiccups.
No.
Okay.
We continue with the work towards preparation for the salt waste processing facility startup.
During the last interim period, have there been any major events, significant events that have occurred, such as, you know what I mean by significant events, negative events, so to speak?
No.
Okay.
Any further questions?
Yeah, one other question. If you had to list your 3 priority issues that are troubling y'all today with regard to schedule, what would they be?
I think that the preparations in the program to support the startup of SWPF on time by the end of the year. There is a lot of work to be done, the modifications to the transfer lines to facilitate or to enable the final tie-ins, and some other modifications that we need in the facilities to support the planned rates for the salt waste processing facility.
Any concern about WIP being ready? Or,
WIP,
yeah, you said that WIP was Waste Isolation Pilot Plant was going through an analysis of the TruePack. I assume that that's a job that they're doing to support your schedule, or do you feel comfortable with that?
Savannah, the team is a combination of Savannah River employees and WIP, and at this point, that work is going well. They are working with the documentation and other activities for readiness, and at this point, we see it complete on time.
I have a question, Narendra Malik. You mentioned that SWPF tie-in will be sometime this end of this year. Have they fixed any date or
You want to?
Yeah. Jim Folk, DOE. No, as of this point in time, the Parsons has submitted a contract modification proposal. The department's reviewing that, and over the next month or two, they should be working out the details of that.
Thank you.
Ken Sejuan, CAB member, Savannah State University. Thus far, whatever you have processed, according to your report, so where the process material is going again underneath the ground, or processing facility where you put this process material?
Okay, so when I say that salt solution has been processed, let's say in the ARPMCU, which just ended, we ended that operation, the product, which is the high activity component of the processing, the high activity product from ARPMCU goes to DWPF, that gets into canisters for storage, and then the low activity component, which is the decontaminated salt solution, goes to saltstone, which is get then formed into a grout, saltstone form, in the saltstone disposal and disposed of permanently in the saltstone disposal units. As far as when I speak about processing in the saltstone facility, again, it's receiving that decontaminated salt solution and then put it in the grout as a saltstone waste form in the saltstone disposal units. When we talk about processing or operating the 3H evaporator, what we're doing there is we're introducing salt solution into the evaporator, and what we call the bottoms go back. They go back into the tank farms, awaiting to be processed through salt processing facilities, and then the overheads go to the effluent treatment facility, where that overhead is going to be treated to remove all contaminants and hazardous material, and the clean stream water coming out of it goes to the creek, which is regulated by the Department of Health and Environmental Control. And the bottoms from that effluent treatment process goes back to the tank farms. And then, we receive high activity waste through sludge and the salt processing facility into DWPF, the Defense Waste Processing Facility, and that gets vitrified into a glass that stabilizes and immobilizes those highly radioactive components, and then that's poured into a stainless steel canister, and those canisters are then stored on a temporary basis in the glass waste storage buildings.
So where this canister will go ultimately?
That is to be
Determined.
determined.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, long answer, but you answered.
I'm sorry.
Very thorough answer. Narendra Malik, you mentioned that in FY19 there have been only 29 canisters filled. Why the number is so low?
That is a great question. So that is a very low number because actually our target for production in the Defense Waste Processing Facility is determined by how much salt waste we are going to process in the year. The reason is that we have a limited amount of sludge in the tank farms, and we want to pair sludge with salt. And it is, at this point, we consider efficient to pour canisters only in the measure that we can introduce salt waste, the cesium and the strontium that we remove from the salt waste with the sludge, and try not to pour canisters that have sludge only.
If you mix cesium, will it change the composition of the material in the canister?
No, we have, for years, we produced canisters with sludge only, from 1996 until 2008, when we actually started the operation of the ARP-MCU, and the quality of the glass was proven, and there was no problem with it. Obviously, the recipe of the glass that is introduced changes now that we are introducing salt in the cesium and strontium in the glass. So the quality doesn't change. It just changes the recipe.
Well, sure, the quality doesn't change, but will it be more radioactive compared to without cesium? It's
still it is still very radioactive with the sludge. The cesium gives more of a temporary increases the radioactivity temporarily because cesium has a half-life that is pretty short compared to the long-lived radionuclides that you have in the sludge. So,
Any more questions?
Well, just a quick
Please.
question, Malcolm Phillips. With regard to what's in the sludge, I assume y'all guys have a printout that has all the elements, and is it possible that we could get a copy of that someplace? You know, not tonight, but at some point, because that would be kind of neat to try to understand what are the radioactive elements in there and their their half-lives or whatever.
we will we'll work on giving you a list of what we analyze for, which are the key radionuclides that we look for in the sludge. We'll work something out.
Does that mean the key radionuclides that are in the sludge? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, we have a system waste characterization database that lists and keeps with the inventory of the waste in the tanks.
Thank you, Sunny.
All right.
Let's continue with the committee discussions. We had two presentations at Savannah, one by Sunny on liquid waste system plan for Rev 21, and TCCR by a demonstration by Penn Mason. Jeff and Penn. Any questions or discussions on the plans? I have it. I've been thinking after the presentation on TCCR1, how much is going to be real waste? And I remember, Penn, you mentioned that whatever the waste will be, will be treated as low-level waste and go to the trenches. Have we really given a thought, is really low-level waste or high-level waste? And should it really go to trenches?
Yeah, Jim Folk, let me, while they're cogitating their answer back there. So I just want to repeat the question, make sure we understand it. So there are two waste streams coming off the ticker, right? One is the DSS stream, decontaminated salt solution, very similar to what Sunny described from the ARP-MCU process. So it's gone through the resin, the bulk of the cesium has been stripped out, and it goes on to tank 11, eventually on to salt stone, okay? The second component is the resin itself. The ion exchange media is the official name, I guess. And that's where we extract the cesium onto. So which stream were you thinking about? And if you could repeat the question.
Give an explanation on both streams.
On
both streams.
Both streams. Okay, so DSS already talked about, it meets the requirements of the WAC, gets grouted on site. The resin, the ion exchange media, what we are doing right now is when we exhaust that column, we'll take that column out, set it aside, okay? We have a location pad set up for that storage. And then when you look into the future, what do you do with that resin? There are two options. And one of these was talked about with our agreement with the state when we were processing this material, is that if an off-site location is identified and licensed for disposal of that material, within 5 years, we will begin moving that material to that location for permanent disposal. If we end up getting toward the end of the liquid waste program and decide that there is no off-site location, then our backup plan is that we can take that resin, grind it, and introduce it into a sludge batch for vitrification. So it's not a waste without a path. It has a path. That would be DWPF. We're hoping for a better path in the future, which would be able to ship and dispose of.
Continuation of that, I have a food for thought. Can you decide to send this resin to Salt Lake, where the hazardous and mixed waste landfills are? Salt Lake City, I'm sorry.
There, as of now, I'm not aware of any location that is licensed to receive this material. So when that happens, we will be right there first in line to see if they can receive the material.
There's no place in the world that can receive this material.
Can it go to Carlsbad?
Carlsbad? Well, right now, you would characterize this as high-level waste.
Okay.
Right? Remember the interpretation, we'll talk about that in a little bit, right? It might be a lead into that discussion, but as of now, it would not be suitable for disposal at WIP.
Any more questions or clarification you need on these two presentations?
Malcolm Phillips again, with regard to the licensing of facilities that are facilities that are licensed to receive it, are there any that have license applications submitted that are in the process of being licensed? Is the Texas site, as an example, is that?
I can only say there's rumored to be a site. I don't know if anybody has better information, but from what I know, there's rumored to be a site that's out there working, and basically what you're looking at is greater than Class C license, right? So their site's rumored. I wouldn't want to put a name out there since I'm not 100% positive, but there are rumored to be sites out there that are working on a greater than Class C license. So if that were to occur, this may become a good candidate material to go to that site.
That's one. Second question, Malcolm Phillips again. With regard to, you reiterated twice, now it's high-level waste. Given the half-life, when does it become low-level waste? Is that 50 years, 40 years, 30 years? Cesium, I forgot the half-life of cesium.
Yeah, this is a great question for what we're going to tee up a little bit later on. This all links back into the high-level waste interpretation, right? So this might be a candidate for that interpretation one day. As we've said and has been put out in the press, DOE is only looking at one waste stream for that interpretation, and none others have been considered. But this certainly might be a candidate one day.
Any further questions on these two presentations made in Savannah? I'd like to say that both presentations were very nicely presented. Thank you, Sunny, Jeff, and Penn. And they were very informative, and I'm sure we'll be looking forward to listening to your Jeff and Penn, your next presentation in Charleston, and then based on that, we'll see if we need to make any recommendations that TCCR should be installed in other tank form or not. We have two recommendations we can't discuss and we can't vote because we don't have a quorum. So we'll be discussing these two recommendations, 356 and 357, in our August meeting. Hopefully we will have the quorum at that time. Any public comments? No? No takers?
Can we discuss them?
You can discuss the responses. The only thing that we can't do is determine
Vote, yeah.
whether or not you want to forward it to the full board for closure. So if you want to talk about them, please do.
Well, I was thinking that because if you have read it there very nicely, I mean, I was going to ask to accept it, but now we can't do that. So if you want to read it and discuss it, I'm open to that.
I apologize. I didn't. I'm not a member of the board, so I didn't, or of the committee, so I didn't read this, and I apologize for that. I should have read it and been able to ask questions in that regard.
Any member want to discuss it?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Greg Murray Cab. I was looking at 357, and I was pleased to see that this recommendation was accepted. The recommendation was to work with WIP, basically, on these shipments, and it appears from my reading of the response letter that was interpreted as forwarding the recommendation to the folks in at WIP. And is that a correct interpretation of what happened?
I think if Sunny just mentioned that they're working with WIP to make sure their WAC is accepting this material. Sunny, please correct me if I'm stating it right or wrong.
Yes, this is Sonny Blanco, DOE. This was last year, and yes, as we said in our letter of response, we said that the recommendation from the CAP to accelerate the true waste shipments to WIP with an emphasis on legacy waste was provided to the DOE Carlsbad Field Office as additional information for consideration for the National True Waste Program 5-year plan. And as the shipping capability of WIP increases, the need to accelerate the true waste shipments from SRS to WIP will continue to be communicated to the DOE Carlsbad Field Office. When they have the corporate board meetings, this is definitely high in the discussion, and Jim has more details about that discussion.
Yeah, Jim Folk, DOE. So just maybe take one step back to make sure we all understand the process, right? So the Carlsbad Field Office, National True Program, is what they're in charge of. And so they coordinate the many shipments across the entire complex. And what they do in that process, in part, is looking at the priorities set for each of the sites, whether it might be regulatory driven, it might be program driven, whatever, to enhance or make sure that the department most expeditiously disposes of true material. Okay, so that's step one. So that's coordinate through the Carlsbad Field Office. Now, a couple things along those lines is that we meet with them. For instance, Sonny mentioned the True Corporate Board session, which will be held at the end of July, where all the executives, managers from each site and appropriate representatives get together, have discussions affecting the national program. They do that twice a year. In addition to that, we have, and I'm part of this, a biweekly phone call with all the sites around the complex. What are your needs? What are your priorities? That kind of thing. And then on a lower level, there's still a weekly interchange at the working level for all that. Now, part of what you may or may not recall also is that after the 2014 event, they set about a process, redefined how they were going to characterize and recertify all of the waste that was out there and existing. So we are actively working that process. For instance, we sent, and I can't remember the exact number, between 6,000 and 8,000 documents for our 125 shipments of material we sent out to Carlsbad as part of that recertification process. Now, that is starting to bear fruit. As Sonny mentioned, we have 2 shipments scheduled now in July, and we have a total of 4 shipments worth of material that have now gone through that entire process. So we're starting to see, and again, from a prioritization perspective, Idaho had just massive quantities of material and significant regulatory drivers, which the February 14th event really pushed back. Our true program is not part of any kind of regulatory commitment with DHEC or anything like that. Some states have it, so obviously that's where the priority goes. What we're seeing now is they've made a lot of success in that Idaho program, and they're starting to have the opportunity now to start looking at us, Oak Ridge, Lano, and some of the other programs. So is it entirely there? Not quite, but we're clearly seeing the momentum coming back to pick us back up into that process. So, cautious optimism. We're making success there, working really hard with Carlsbad and like to get the priority back to finish our 125 shipments. It'll be a while yet, but we are seeing that focus get back.
Malcolm Phillips, the fact that you're going to have a shipment in July or 2 shipments in July, is this indicative that the characterization of your waste has been accepted in the WIP process? So it's a matter now simply the shipments if the characterization has been accepted into their structure.
Yeah, Jim Folk, that's exactly right. So this has gone through all of the new requirements, met all that without issue. They are fully approved now, ready for shipment. So now it just enters the queue, right? For whenever we can work them in. And again, when you think about priority, so for us, we have a clock. So our last shipment was August a year ago. So we basically have a 1-year clock within which you can complete the shipment. If you extend that, you have to go back into another readiness assessment. So again, we communicated with them, said our priority is to get a shipment out before we have to go through another readiness review and assessment. They responded and said, we'll be there. So again, good communication, good success. We still got 123 to go. So, we're working our way through it. But again, we're seeing responsiveness out of that organization, and we're getting there.
Does DOE, have they established an overall schedule that factors in your 123 additional shipments?
No, what they do is, and this is what we talk about every 2 weeks, they have total number of shipments that are available for each of the sites, and then they have what they call a rolling 8-week window. So that's where they put the details together on where the truck is going to go. There are multiple trucks, where those trucks are going to go, based on weather, based on what's available, based on condition at the mine, right? How much can they receive? So those guys look at that and then develop that detailed 8-week window for where everybody's going to go. And that's where our 2 shipments now show up on that rolling 8-week window.
I'd like to follow up, I mean. Thank you. I guess this comes down to, this isn't anything about what DOE has done. I guess I'm wondering about CAB as how we process things. To me, what this sounds like, the definition of work with WIP is to send them the recommendation and then do probably what they were doing anyhow. I don't know if that was the intention of the CAB or not. If this was in July of 2018, I was on the CAB. Quite frankly, I don't remember that. And I take my share of the responsibility for it. But it sounds like this is just what we were doing anyhow.
Well, I can talk, Gil Allensworth Cab. I can talk to it from a process standpoint. And James and Jim, correct me, if I step all over the place. We make recommendations to DOE Savannah River. So Mike Budney was the site manager at the time, correct? July 2018. So we make recommendations that go directly to the site manager. Now the site manager can coordinate with Washington and Carlsbad and the things that Jim was talking about, but ultimately DOE Savannah River responds to us. So I think just saying that they forwarded our recommendation to WIP is, maybe that's kind of
Well, that's what their letter says. That's exactly what the letter says. They forwarded the recommendation to the Carlsbad office.
Right, but I guess I'm just getting, you weren't, I have a record, I'm going back here on CAB of being very stickler to what our bylaws and our rules and things, and I kind of used to be a horse's patoot about that. And so I'm kind of going back to that. We don't make recommendations to Carlsbad. We don't make recommendations to Washington. So I understand their letter says that, but I guess I really don't have a point of contention. It's just that this is how we're governed. This is how we do it. They chose, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, and Jim Folk, Dewey. And I want to be clear, it wasn't simply a case of the letter shooting across the table, okay? Just as I mentioned earlier, when Carlsbad looks at that long list of priorities, and again, regulatory drivers are going to be the primary thing that gets you there, right? But it was submitted for their awareness that our Citizens Advisory Board believes we need to up the schedule. So again, it's not clearly for action, as Gil said, right? We can't drive them. I can't drive them either. They're their own entity. However, making them aware that the citizens group is out there saying, you really ought to be working on this, and that's how we communicated with them.
So for me,
for your awareness, there's a driver.
Basically, they used our recommendation to put pressure on Carlsbad. I guess he can't say that, but that's what I'm reading between the lines.
Okay, I accept that. I wonder what the practical effect of that is, because they probably get reams of paper,
Sounds like
and the fact that we at SRS would like them to take more of our waste is not a shock. So I wonder. I'm thinking about how we word our recommendations in the future, in terms of maybe eliciting more details, in terms of responses to us. That's my only thought on this. I mean, they've accepted what we've proposed, and it's fine. It's just, I don't know that this
Well, I can tell you,
pushes anything forward.
I wish Doug was here because I'd like to have backup when I say something like this. But when we were out at WIP a year and a half ago, and this is a point of contention, depending on where you are in New Mexico. But when we were at WIP with all the other chairs, we were welcomed with open arms, and the delegation, their political delegation, spoke to us, and they want to bring it. They are open for business. And now there's obviously a political aspect to that. We deal with it in South Carolina and Georgia, but I mean the local area of Carlsbad, they're like, this is what we're here for. This is what it was built for. Let's use it. That's what Doug and I got. So I don't want to speak out of turn and just say this is Gil's opinion, but that's what was spoken to us, and we were kind of shocked that it was that, because we've been given a bill thinking, oh, they don't want this, that, Savannah River's got this horrible stuff. And they're like, no, this is what this was built for. And WIP actually has a plan to build 2 other WIPs basically underneath the current mine and another one above the mine. So they can triple their capacity, and they're not even at capacity on the current level. So this is all just discussion, but I don't know anything else, but I can only talk to you about how we deal with things and how it was dealt with when we were
I
out there.
think I can add, Narendra Malakab. I think the reason why DOE SRS has sent the letter to Carlsbad is because they are the receiving party. And we want to make sure, SRS maybe want to make sure that their waste acceptance criteria meets the requirements of our waste. So if we do not communicate with them, then things can get lost in between Aiken and Carlsbad. So probably that's the reason they had DOE SRS has to communicate with Carlsbad office to ensure that it's a smooth transition.
Narendra, before we get too much further, I know that Jim had something that he wanted to bring up today. We've only got 15 minutes left in this meeting. I think we should turn it over and let him talk about it, because I think you're probably going to have a few questions about that. It is.
Good, because that was my question.
So let's let Jim talk to the high-level waste interpretation just for a few minutes and talk about what the rollout plan is for.
Do you need to pause at 5:45, or are we okay?
Yeah, do we need any public comment?
Are there any public comments?
No, I already asked. There
I
were
know
no
you
comments.
asked, but we'll ask again right on time.
Yes, do that for the record.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, again, Jim Folk. We have an opportunity, so we'd like to put it out in front of everybody, and hopefully we can incorporate it into the July agenda. As you know, DOE recently came out with its high-level waste interpretation. And so the opportunity we have is that one of the crafters of that interpretation, Mr. Mark Senderling at DOE headquarters, has offered to come down for the July session, make a presentation on the high-level waste interpretation, what it means, and be willing to answer whatever questions you, and we may offer up the public as well, have to ask about that high-level waste interpretation.
In this case, yeah.
Yeah, what-
Because we'll have the opportunity there to do it with somebody from headquarters. It's a unique situation, but we'll bend our rules a little bit.
This is North Augusta?
It is.
I'm just thinking of the space, because if it gets out that you can ask questions, people will show up.
Yeah, now, and I think we've talked a little bit about. We'll keep it fairly confined for them. Won't be make it the afternoon. But anyway, it's an opportunity, and he offered. So we'd like to recommend that you take that and we put it on the agenda and we work the details.
When will we have that confirmed that he's coming?
He's already told me he's prepared to do it.
Confirmed already?
Yeah.
Wow, we need to get that out to the full board.
We'll get it out there when we put out the agenda and everything else.
Okay, yeah, I don't need to.
Yeah. So he confirmed Friday he's been approved or authorized to come on down here and have that conversation with us.
I have a question about, and this may be more to the July meeting, so I may be jumping the gun, Jim. But when I'm reading the recommendation response to 356, and especially bullet point 3, 4, and 5, I understand they're mostly the same answer. Does the new definition affect? Does the new definition affect affect that?
Yeah, the official answer, and we've been taught pretty well on this one. The official answer is there's only one waste stream currently under consideration. If you saw at the same time that the interpretation was released, there was also an announcement that there would be an environmental assessment on the applicability of our DWPF recycle stream to pursue that interpretation and potential disposal at an off-site facility. So there will be an EA done for the recycle stream, consideration of disposal. No other streams are under consideration at this point.
Malcolm Phillips, and I almost am embarrassed to ask the question, but I'll ask it anyway because I don't know. You're saying the high-level waste interpretation, is that codified or is that a policy?
That's a great question for July 30th. But again, the fundamental is that DOE, in its interpretation, has made that interpretation, okay, that they can go through and pursue, given those set of criteria that were listed, that it could meet a disposal facilities, WAC and requirements, disposal requirements. That like a less than Class C has that list of expectations. So if it meets that, that is DOE's interpretation of that policy.
Okay, it's an interpretation, so it's not written, it's not in stone from the standpoint like a regulation to change a reg codified, you got to do certain things.
Well, again, I'm going to give you a no comment on that,
okay,
and suggest that you wait for Mark on July 30th to ask that level of detail, because that takes it down. Even those of us on the site have not been that engaged in all of that activity. Mark's the guy to ask for all the specifics.
Gil Allen with CAP, following up on Malcolm, I think he's asking the question probably the way it probably needs to be asked. So I was under the impression this is basically the IAEA was really pushing this. Am I right? Who was the people?
You're thinking of that report from the Energy Communities Alliance.
There it was, yeah. So the ECA, this is basically what they wanted, right? That they were.
If I recall, yeah, there was. The report suggested that.
Okay, I don't want to get caught there, but that's kind of my interpretation during that time when we had that presentation and we heard from them was that this was going to take, and I mean not facetiously, but literally, it was going to take an act of Congress to change this. Is that what he's asking?
Yeah. If it's a reg, you got to go through an act of Congress.
So this is something to find out.
Yeah.
This is a question for July 30th. Okay, thanks. Asked and answered. I didn't understand you, Malcolm. My bad.
One thing that I'd recommend, I did this over the weekend for a separate project, but if you go to the Federal Register website, federalregister.gov, and you look up the high-level waste interpretation notice that was put out, it's quite lengthy, but it's also an interesting read. If you're into this stuff at all, it's worth looking up. It really is worth looking up and actually reading it. They actually tackle some of the questions that you're having. And I think that'll help prep you better for the July 30th when Mark Centerling comes down.
Could you send the
If you have
link?
the opportunity to do that. I'll send you the link out.
He's giving you homework for yourself.
When you send the link, do you send it to everybody or just the
I
committee
will.
members?
In this case, I will, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, pre-work for the meeting would be good. Before we move on, Gil Allensworth Cap, thank you, Jim and DOE and James and Delisa and everything. It's pretty exciting. This is what my fourth, almost 5 years on the cab, and to have such a big decision as reg or codified or whatever have a change, and especially for South Carolina and so many people wanting to see stuff move out of South Carolina and go get out of here and go to a disposition path. To see that this is happening is exciting, but what I'm really appreciative of y'all is that such a high-level decision maker will be here to speak to us, and thank you. That means a lot. So I'll say that at the board meeting as well. That's a big deal, and I don't want us to just gloss over. Oh yeah, that's right. Thank you.
If we have 7 more minutes, I have another comment or question, if that's possible. Or you want to cut it now?
I think it's getting very close. We will discuss this in our next meeting. Any more questions or clarifications? If none, the meeting is closed.